Hey guys, it's Cece, and today I am here to do my January wrap-up. So 2018 has begun, and it's begun with sort of an odd reading month wherein I read a ton. I read 9 books in January, which is the best I've done in a few months, but also I felt very middling about almost everything I read. I have a lot of 3-star books to talk about. Before we get into reviews, a quick check-in. I have a couple of monthly goals set for myself, and so far, 1 month in, I'm doing okay. I did in fact read at least 1 adult release in January. I read more than 1. I read more than 1 2018 release, and I read something from my top 12 TBR. With all that in mind, we are going to start with the books that I rated the lowest, work up to my highest ratings, and yeah, that's pretty much it. These are all of the books I read in January. Let's get started. The first book I'm going to talk about is The Year They Burned the Books by Nancy Garden. This is a re-release of one of Nancy Garden's books. I think it came out in 1999 originally, but they've been re-releasing it. It was on NetGalley, I got approved, and I didn't like it at all. This is super basically about a group of teenagers in high school who run the school newspaper, and when they want to start talking about controversial subjects, then a lot of the more conservative people in the community really start to pitch a fit. The main character is a queer girl, and she also has a best friend who's gay. And I will say the thing that I think this book did best is that it's been a while since I've read a YA book wherein the main character is questioning instead of just being in the closet, and both her and her best friend spend most of the book as questioning. Actually, when the book starts, they both qualify themselves as maybes. I really liked that bit of the storyline. Unfortunately, that's kind of where things I like end. Baseline to start everything off, I don't think this was written very well. I have read one of Nancy Garden's other books, Annie on My Mind, and I thought it was really nice, but this book was just choppy and poorly written, and the dialogue was really stilted, and I couldn't stand it. The other thing I will say going in is this isn't necessarily a bad thing. I know that this book was written in 1999, but if you are a person who can't handle reading about a lot of homophobia, then I would not recommend that you try this book out. It's not just about homophobia, the characters face an incredible amount of it. It is in the form of homophobic slurs, a lot of bullying. And what I really hated the most was that this book pushed the love the sinner, hate the sin way of thinking, and I hate that. I don't think that there's a place for it. There is no loving a person in spite of their gayness. You're homophobic, and that's kind of it. So if you can't handle any of those things, then I still wouldn't recommend reading this book. It was hard to get through, didn't really like it, and I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Next up, I want to talk about The Only Harmless Great Thing by Brooke Bolander. This is a novella that came out in January that Tor.com sent me an early copy of, and I clearly didn't like this either, since it's so down low on this list. This is a science fiction novella, sort of, that's about intertwining narratives of women in a factory in New Jersey slowly dying of radiation poisoning, as well as elephants. It's about intertwining tragedies, but let me just explain to you that this book is almost incomprehensible. It took until the very end before I even figured out what was going on, and by the time I got to that point, I didn't care. It was hard to differentiate at the beginning whether or not they were talking in our time or in the past, because there are storylines in both times. Also, a third of this book is narrated by sort of a collective voice of the elephants. It was just a very confusing book. I wanted to like it, I wanted to appreciate giving a voice to the voiceless, which is sort of what this book was attempting to do, but it was incomprehensible. I didn't know what was going on most of the time, so I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Moving on to Room by Emma Donoghue. I finally did it. I finally read Room. This was the book from my top 12 to read this year list. Sadly, we have not gotten off to a good start with that list. This book is about a boy named Jack and his mother, and the only world they know is an 11 by 11 room. That's sort of all you want to go into this book knowing. It's narrated by Jack, who is 5 years old, and him and his mother have been in this room for Jack's entire life. Mostly this book was just not memorable. I finished it and I couldn't remember a bunch of stuff that had happened at the beginning. Since I finished it, I've forgotten a bunch of other stuff. Also, I think I've decided that I don't like books narrated by kids, and maybe that's like close-minded of me, but I was so annoyed with this kid, and I shouldn't have been because I know what he's going through is an incredibly difficult time, but I can't handle books, I don't think, that are narrated by children. That's kind of what I learned from reading this book. It is incredibly hard to get through, it's heartbreaking, it's difficult, but ultimately just not that memorable, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I also read MeetCute, which is an anthology edited by Jennifer L. Armentrout, and it is just a collection of stories about teens meeting, like, their first moment, a meet-cute. So I'll admit that I'm not the hugest fan of anthologies. You should probably know that before I review this book, but I was interested in it. I thought that it had potential and it seemed cute, and I think half of the stories were really cute and wonderful, and the other half were just really blah, and I didn't care, and that's my biggest problem with anthologies. I have never read one that wasn't split in half by good stories and really mediocre stories. This anthology actually had way more queer romances than expected. They were all female-female romances. I could have done with some more male-male romances, but as a gay lady, it made me really happy to see as many stories as I did with ladies falling in love. The story by Meredith Russo had a trans girl as a main character, and a lot of the stories featured POC main characters. So in terms of diversity, lots of points. I think that this did a good job. My favorite story was one by Emery Lord. It was named Oomph. It was the only 5-star one that I read in this entire anthology, but I could read a full book about those two girls falling for each other. I've never read anything by Emery Lord, and that was the only story that I read in this whole anthology that was like, okay, I've got to read more by this author. But a lot of the other ones just felt either like they weren't very well written, or they were trying to pack in way too much story in a short period of time, especially the ones that were really trying to evoke an emotional response. A lot of the time it felt forced and like they were asking for emotion that was going unearned, because I just didn't care that much. If you want to see a full breakdown of the reviews I gave each and every one of the stories in this anthology, I will leave my review linked in the description below. Breaks it all down, gives a little like 1-sentence review and a star rating, but when I averaged out all my star ratings, this wound up being a 3 out of 5 star anthology. Moving on, we have What We Lose by Zinzi Clemmons. I just sort of picked up this book on a whim from my library. I was looking for some interesting books. This one popped out at me, so I read it. This book is about Thandi, who was raised in Pennsylvania, but her mother and her mother's entire family lives in Johannesburg in South Africa. So a lot of it is this main character working through race and identity, where she stands as an American, as a mixed race woman. At the same time, her mother has recently died, and so she's trying to work through all these questions of identity while trying to work through grief and while not having this woman around who is an anchor to part of her life. This book is told in vignettes, and I think some of it really excelled. I loved how it talked about grief. It was absolutely heartbreaking, but I really, really felt connected to those passages. I was also really interested in the bits that were working through Thandi's identity, going to visit her family in South Africa, determining her identity. All of that was really interesting, but I didn't care very much about the stuff that was about her current life and the man that she was sleeping with. All of that just felt kind of out of place in this story. It was sadly just a very mixed bag where I could see the potential, I could see the writing and the power, but I was frustrated with how this was put together and the overall kind of storyline we were supposed to get out of it. So I wound up giving this book 3 out of 5 stars. It ended and I was just left feeling sort of middling, like there was something that had been missing for the entire book. Next up we have The Apocalypse of Elena Mendoza by Shaun David Hutchinson. This book comes out on February 6th and it was sent to me by Simon & Schuster for review. This book is about Elena Mendoza, a 16-year-old bisexual Cuban girl who is the product of a virgin birth. When a girl Elena has a crush on, Freddie, gets shot in the Starbucks parking lot, Elena has the ability to heal her. Moments later, the shooter David disappears up into the sky. And now that she's healed one person, it's becoming more and more clear that the world might possibly be coming to an end, and Elena is the only one who can do anything about it. So I have a full review for this book as well on my Goodreads, which I will link down below. I wanted to love this book so much. I will say, if you've read a book by Shaun David Hutchinson before, I think that this kind of holds the standard for the type of writing that he does, in that it's very introspective, it's very philosophical, and it never gives you an easy answer. And those are all things that I love about his writing. Unfortunately, this book is about 400 pages long, and it's really character-focused. It's a character study more than there being a very strong plot. And I just never cared about any given character. I wanted to love Elena, I wanted to love Freddie, I wanted to love Elena's friend Fadil. There were so many people that I wish I could have been intrigued by, but I just never was. Especially Freddie, who is the love interest. She was so mean for most of the book that I had a hard time really getting behind the romance. I think I would have been more interested in her if she hadn't been the love interest. Also, the middle bit of this book felt very repetitive and circular, which was sort of frustrating. I feel like this could have been shorter. And I understand why it was the length that it was, because so much of this book is Elena asking questions of herself, of the universe, of the people around her, and she really has to work through those issues on her own. But the more and more I read of it, since I wasn't that invested in Elena's character, the more I felt like I wasn't invested in her asking the same questions over and over again. The strongest part of this book by far was the ending. I think that it was the perfect balance of character, of huge philosophical choices, and not being given every single answer on a platter. I think that you have to work a little bit with Shaun David Hutchinson's books, and I loved that I got to the end and it felt like that again. I felt like I had to work for an answer that would make me as a reader satisfied. So yeah, sadly, even though this was one of my most anticipated releases of the entire year, I wound up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. I'm super sad that I didn't love this one as much as I was hoping I would. Next, I want to talk about Stiletto by Daniel O'Malley. This was actually the first book that I read in 2018, and it is the sequel to The Rook. The Rook is basically about a secret government agency in London, and they are dedicated to protecting the citizens of Europe from supernatural threats. They've got a real Men in Black vibe, where they're this covert government agency that's doing really intense stuff, but it's also incredibly funny. It mixes these huge battles and monsters with kind of the drudge of government work, and it's really hysterical. Tonally, I have no idea how to explain this book, but it is just such a winner. The first one and the second one. The second book, Stiletto, I think was way too long, but it did have this really great feature where it's introduced 2 new POV characters. So Miffany from the first book returns as a POV character eventually, but this is narrated by 2 additional women, and their relationship is sort of the driving force of the book. Their friendship, and coming from totally opposite sides of a conflict, but kind of reconciling and getting to know each other as people instead of as enemies. It still does amazing work on the tone. I laugh constantly when I read these books, and this was, I think, a very fitting sequel to The Rook. I just wish it had been a little bit shorter. So this one I gave 3.5 out of 5 stars. I gave the original 4 because I think that the pacing was just a little tighter. This one is still a great sequel, just not quite as strong as that first one. Second to last, we have This Is Really Happening by Erin and Chack. This is a memoir or an essay collection of just things from Erin's life. I'm really easy to please when it comes to memoirs. It doesn't take much, but I did really enjoy this. I thought it mixed being really funny and talking about being a millennial and struggling with moving into adulthood, while also being introspective and really looking at some of the harder moments of Erin's life. This was honestly just incredibly charming. I read it very quickly, consumed it, loved it. I highly recommend it if you are also a person who likes memoirs, especially memoirs by impressive women. It's a really fantastic collection of essays, and I loved it, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And finally, my favorite book that I read in January was Foolish Hearts by Emma Mills. Foolish Hearts is about a girl named Claudia who accidentally overhears the breakup of the it couple at her school. And by the way, the it couple at her school are Paige and Iris. They're both ladies. Yes. But this puts her on Iris's bad side, which only gets more awkward when they are forced to work together on a school production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. I would just like to say, thank God for this book about girls being friends and not being jealous of other girls when they're friends with each other, just building each other up constantly and being supportive and talking. This was such a good female friendship book. I can't get over it. I loved Emma as a character and her feeling of being kind of an outsider, but as she becomes friends with Iris, then she gets to be a little bit more on the inside and become more of her own person. This also includes one of my absolute favorite things that's ever happened in a YA contemporary, where Iris is telling Claudia that she isn't out to her parents, and when Claudia's like, well, isn't that really hard to not be who you are? Iris responds, oh great, is Strady McHetro going to give me a lecture on living my truth? I had to put the book down. I laughed so hard. But this book is absolutely fantastical. It has not been overhyped. It is a wonderful YA contemporary about female friendship that also has a romance between the main character and this guy. This is me we're talking about. I was so invested in their relationship. He was wonderful. It probably didn't hurt that he reminded me really strongly of Gansey from The Raven Cycle. Maybe that was part of it, but like, I loved them. I loved this main character. I loved her family. The book was everything. I wound up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. Maybe it was closer to a 4.5, but it was wonderful. I highly recommend it. Everyone should read it. And that's it. Those are all of the things that I read in January. What do you think of the books I read? This was kind of a middling month. I'm hoping that February is a little bit stronger, but I have some really good books picked out for February, so. What did you read in the month of January? What was your favorite thing that you read? Let me know down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!